Welcome to Conversations from the Edge of Consciousness. I'm your host, Christine Madera. For me, and possibly for you, the inner world of consciousness has always been much more real and way more fun than the so-called real material world. Growing up, I thought I was alone in this, but I'm not. There are a lot of us, and far too many have no one to talk to who shares this experience. I've been lucky to cultivate a community of friends who love to talk about the energies, ideas, and vibrations that are pushing the edges of our own consciousness, as well as our collective consciousness. In Conversations from the Edge, we share our conversations with you. Welcome to Conversations from the Edge. This is your host, Christine Madera, and we are here today with Alex Boianghu. And we've been doing a series with Alex about the journey to wholeness. And we're going to be having a conversation today on being and doing. So it's going to be quite juicy. So welcome, Alex. It's nice to have you back.
I'm so excited for this one. Let's get going.
All right. Can you just give just a little bit of background on you for anybody that this is their first time listening to one of our podcasts?
Sure. I'm a psychotherapist of around 30 years. And as a human being, I'm a person who's been curious about why am I here and who am I? And that's been my driving force. And I integrate that into the work that I do with people. And I've specialized in the integration of Eastern and Western psychology, where they meet, how they benefit each other and support each other, and understanding who we are and why we're here.
I'm excited to talk with you today about our being and our doing. And we've touched on that at different times, but we've both had a lot of activity going on in our lives. So there's been a lot of things that we're doing. And sometimes it can be a challenge to be in doing. I mean, then there's, of course, this whole idea that people do in order to get to being. So we're going to jump into all of that. But why don't we start with how you define being and doing and the contrast between them?
Sure. We need to return back to kind of like how we develop as human beings. So obviously, as human beings, life is doing. I mean, doing for me is simply the activity of life, right? So, it's not like doing in isolation, I'm doing something now and I'm not doing anymore. It's simply being alive is the act of activity. And we don't stop that until our bodies are no longer functioning to do the activities. The question is what guides the activity, meaning what are the unconscious or conscious motivations? What are we seeking? So that's what's important to understand. So we can see that all of us develop in the context of where our doing let's say in childhood is a way to figure out who we are, how to belong, how to make it within our own family of origin. So a lot of our doing is a way to support our psychological and spiritual well-being. And what we learn in the doing is there are certain kinds of doings that make us feel better or make people like us, right? So then what ends up happening is we learn that those doings, those activities feed something within us. But the problem is that they become very myopic, very, very, very focused that, for example, let's say the child who's the perfectionist straight A student. So that child in their doing, their activity is be perfect at school because everyone will acknowledge me and will take the pressure off of my alcoholic father because I am the golden child. So you see, then I'm just giving that as an example. I mean, other people may have the perfectionistic, good student without having an alcoholic father. I'm just using that as an example. So the doing for that child is loaded, and it actually takes them away from being who they are. When we say being is that quality, that energetic quality of feeling full and whole and vibrant that's free of our conditioning. And it's like if you ever see anybody doing Tai Chi, Qigong, there's yoga practices. There's also martial art practices in the Japanese tradition and some other traditions where the movement is done from the space of letting go of any attachment to the outcome There is no seeking of anything. It's simply a natural expression of the body flowing as the expression of being. It's seamless.
When I was doing Tai Chi, and I do it on and off, but one of the things I love about Tai Chi when I'm doing it is that it's almost as if the energy and the motion is doing you, versus you let go of the intention of the movement, and that movement arises from its own inner movement. I don't know how to describe it another way, but it's kind of like allowing life to live you, allowing the movement to move you, being so seamlessly part of that flow of energy that you're responding and moving with it versus being the originator of
it. It is who we are. That energy, that source, what you're describing is, we call it the source of the ground of being, right? And if you notice, this is what I was talking to you about before, which is, so let's just take an example. I want to do something, whatever that is. It's an X, right? And in wanting to do that, if we're really subtle, we'll notice that there's a slight anxiety agitation, because we want to be in activity as a way to return back to the source of being. And what happens is we greatly become disappointed and frustrated. And the classic Advaita Vedanta, or the non-dual approach, basically says no person, place, thing, experience will ever be the source of you coming home to yourself. It cannot. So anything that's loaded in our activity with the hope that it resolves our existential anxiety of being away from home will never work. Now, we can do a little simple exercise, very simply, is to imagine whatever that doing is going to be. Let's say I'm going to go eat ice cream, and relax the notion of the ice cream. Let go of the image of the ice cream and simply feel the energy that's seeking. When we're left with that energy, what do we experience? Simply just energy. It's simply energy, but there's a slight agitation, and we have to work through this. There's a slight agitation, because the agitation is that there's a hope in there that it's going to help us feel even more free. That's the agitation. What happens is we don't like the agitation, and that's what actually propels us to seek. So this is so profound. It's the ability to be with that slight agitation just a little bit, and recognize that the agitation is not a problem, but it's an invitation to come back to being.
So for me, when I get into that agitated state, what I do is I kind of sit with it, and I allow it to express itself in my energy without acting on it. It generally only lasts, a couple minutes, unless there's another agitation beneath it. But like, if I can sit with it and just allow myself to experience that, and it'll kind of rise like a wave and fall, and then it falls away, and then I come back toward either into or towards in the direction of that beingness. So that's kind of my practice with it. But how do you guide people through releasing or whatever the agitation in order to return to beingness?
Look, you started to name it exactly. Is that it's a being with. Now, there's a certain way of being with energy, and whatever that energy is, be it arousal, be it agitation. Let's just put it this way: any experience. Let's make it general. That has the quality of pulling us away from being grounded in our being. Simply just is put in the category of energy, and then you could just divide it up as it's agitation, it's anxiety, it's this.
Right.
That doesn't matter. So first, is I usually tell people, breathe a little bit. Breathe. Take a minute or two of full body or full yogic breathing, and by doing that, you calm down the nervous system, and maybe 50 to 75% of the agitation will just go away simply by breathing. The remainder of the energy is not simply just by being there, because a lot of times, in the mindfulness community, they're like, okay, just sit with it. What people who are not experienced, by sitting with it, they become agitated, because there's a sense that I, self, and now have to sit with this uncomfortable experience. First, we have to experience that we are spaciousness and timelessness. We have to experience that in the body. There's particular meditative methods that help us experience our vastness. Then, when we experience that vastness, then the agitation doesn't seem like a problem. It's like a small little mosquito floating up in the sky. It's not going to do. It's not going. It's still there. It's like It's like you can have large clouds, small clouds, but the sky is still the same. Here it's the same. It's a meditative way of being, stepping in, experiencing the quality of spaciousness and timelessness within the whole body. And then the energy comes down even more. And when the energy of agitation comes down enough, what happens? We get glimpses and insights into who we really are, simply being, right? That's it. That's how you get there. And then you can relax. Then seeking drops away and you realize, oh my goodness, what I've been wanting the whole time is this.
Well, and I wanted to point out something that you said, but I just didn't want people to miss it. Because it's something that I work with as well, is when your whole attention is on, we'll just call it what was the word you used?
Experience.
Not the experience, but the agitation. When it's all focused on that, when that has your total focus, it's very small, but it takes up your whole whole view, your whole energy. But it is in that creation of spaciousness that then that experience of agitation becomes small within this larger experience of everything. And it's that, for me, it's that broadening of energy, perspective, whatever, expansiveness, awareness, that actually does return me to that experience of beingness. Because anything that's had my attention that was the small irritant kind of gets lost in the vastness of that spaciousness and becomes insignificant.
Yes, and we have a lot of methods to help us shift from a narrow focus on the experience to the vastness of the experiencer. It's like imagine you're looking up at the night sky and you only look through a small telescope and you're like, well, that's it, right? And then you open up your eyes, put the telescope down, and you see the whole night sky. Oh my goodness, it's infinite. And what ends up happening is you stop focusing on the individual star, and you can feel the background on which the star is existing. And this is quantum consciousness. The star that exists within an open dimensional spaciousness. It needs that to appear that way. So all appearances appear only because there's a ground that's infinite. But we forget that. And so what happens is, for us, experience, it becomes a limiting force to our desire to feel infinite. But the more we feel that we're infinite, our experience of contraction will melt away.
I want to bring this back to the being and the doing together, because so much, as you said, to be alive is to be doing. You're always doing, you're in that motion of life, that constant recreation of itself and constant activity. And we have, of course, the activities of daily life that we need to do, brush our teeth and eat and sleep and all these things, and the people and the jobs and all of this kind of stuff. And we often get caught, in one thing of doing after another thing of doing after another thing of doing, in this progression toward some sort of progress or, completion. But how do you, I know how I do it, but how do we begin to be in that state of being while also being in that, the activity of life? And this is separate from the motivation of being or the motivation of doing to come into a state of beingness. This is really about how do we remain in that state of being as we are in that constant activity of life and not getting lost in the doing there.
I'll be honest with you, it requires a great amount of what I call meditative practice and an integration practice. What does that mean? So first, you're taught to meditate, which in Tibetan is translated from the word gom. Gom means to familiarize oneself with what? The state of being. Therefore, meditation in the Eastern traditions was a way for you to become familiar with who you are. Well, in order to do that, we have to settle out the conditioning or the clouds, or the confusion of what we've learned to be able to experience that. Well, we need formal ways to settle out. And meditation, I believe, is the most powerful technique, method rooted deeply in being that allows us to do that. Then, after some time, we start to integrate that. And here was the instructions from one of my teachers. My teacher would say, okay, we've been doing it for some time. We've been settling, experiencing that quality of spaciousness and timelessness. Now, open your eyes. Our eyes are usually open. Reach out for your glass of water now and see if you can relax into the unconditioned way of being while reaching out for your drink of water. And what would happen was you can then experience where the contractions would happen, where the projections would happen, where the grasping would happen, you see? And then you would relax again and reach out. And then only after you've been able to reach out for your glass of water this way, then the next step would be, okay, now move your hands. And now can you imagine, now stand up, now walk, now go do the dishes. And you see, it's a progressive step-by-step way of practicing being. And then, of course, it extends itself into all of life. Does that make sense? You see, that's the integration part.
Yeah. And, and I've done meditation for years and years, and I've developed some other processes I've done or the other ways of accessing the same state. And it may be because I was meditating for so long that these worked for me. But one of the ones that I have found, and I've practiced this while I'm walking, is that when I'm walking, I keep my awareness at the bottoms of my feet.
Sure.
And as I keep my awareness at the bottoms of my feet, like my whole sense of awareness opens up. Sure. And so I'm able to experience me walking and everything else around me. And that state of beingness where, thoughts come and they go, or, I'm aware of the birds or the squirrels or, sometimes the bears or whatever, because I'm in that expanded sense of awareness, I'm not in thought, which for me is that place that makes everything very small. So when I'm focused on thought, like everything squinches up in my head. I just experience things this way. Everything squinches up in my head, and I realize that awareness is very small. And so when I bring it down deeper into my body, so maybe to the heart or to where if I'm sitting on something or when I'm walking to the bottoms of the feet, it opens up that state of awareness so that I'm kind of by default in that state of being, and the doing is doing itself within the being. So thoughts are rising and falling, and neighbors are talking, and things are happening within that awareness, but they're not focused on every little happening that's happening. But that's been really helpful for me to do that. And even if I'm working, like if I'm sitting in front of my computer, I'll drop my awareness down to the bottoms of my legs, and it expands up to that experience of where I'm experiencing me working and this larger awareness around me as I'm working. Like I'm working within the spaciousness as opposed to I'm focused on me doing work. And those have been really helpful for me.
What you're describing here is an amazing technique. It's a methodology that we use all the time. So let's take a look at this for a second. So when you bring your awareness to your feet, there's a couple of things that are going on that's supportive here. Number one, by bringing your awareness to your feet, there's a quality of groundedness that happens. Well, that groundedness within the body, because it's a sensation of the body being grounded. What does it do? It brings our attention away from the thinking process. See, and this is why I'm so big into embodied meditation practices. Therefore, by accessing not just your feet, but everywhere in your body, we can experience the quality of fullness and wholeness and spaciousness and so forth, which then also includes our thinking. It's not that thinking is the issue. It's our engagement and participation and believing that we are a thinking being.
Mm-hmm.
We're not a thinking being. We are being that uses thinking in life to get around. So therefore, by becoming embodied in our meditation practice, thinking, sensations, and feelings don't dictate how we live. They become expressions within the field, and they are not identified as the field. And that's what you noticed. That's exactly what's
Mm-hmm.
happening.
Can you define embodiment for people? Because that, I mean, you and I know what that is, and people, a lot of people do, but that's a new word and a new awareness arising right now. So just not everybody's going to be familiar with that or have a helpful definition of that.
Okay. Simply, I want you to try something for you and for all the listeners.
Okay.
I want you to breathe in through your whole body, from your toes to your head. I want you to notice that the body is energetically permeable, that every
Mm-hmm.
one of the cells has room for the breath to come in and out. And as you do that, notice that you can experience your sense of self, that sense of quality of self, being everywhere in the body, not just thinking, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You notice that now you're embodied.
Okay.
Meaning that we're not divided up into thinking, feeling, sensations and broken as parts. Embodiment means the whole experience of being giving way to our experience of thinking, feeling, sensing, projecting, and so forth. So you see how through that simple breathing exercise, you experience that your sense of self was everywhere in the body, not just located up in the head as a talking head.
Which is the habit that we are taught from
Correct.
our very
Yeah.
very beginning of living, and it's a hard habit to break. I grew up as a head person, and I still, well, I guess I'm not so much anymore, but I had spent, even in meditations and stuff, like my default mode was always to go to the head, and it was always this challenge to continue to move back out of that. But most of the people I meet, out in the world are still, basically talking heads in one form or another. And it can feel threatening in many ways to be larger than the headspace and the thoughts in the head, because once you expand that awareness, you realize that, like, thought doesn't really have all the answers, and thought likes to have all the answers. And so that becomes its own little challenging place.
We often don't ask the question, what are thoughts and where do they come from and what charges them? We don't ask. We take thoughts
Mm-hmm.
as self.
Yes. Yes.
And if you ask somebody simply the following, okay, you've just had 500 thoughts in the last 5 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
and you're aware that you've had that. The one that's aware of all those thoughts, has that quality changed? And the person goes, no. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
so therefore, are you the thoughts or the witness consciousness of thinking? And sometimes it's amazing to me how profound that alone for most people is, like, oh my goodness. So what does that? So then what does that mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who am I then? And that's the process of then learning to stay attentive and bring our awareness to that field of observing without relying on thinking. And that takes a subtle way of paying attention and relaxing into the embodied quality of spaciousness and timelessness. And then you realize, I am that which is timeless and spacious. That's who I
Mm-hmm.
am. And then what happens is you realize thoughts, again, don't interfere with that. Thoughts are not the problem. Emotions are not the problem. Sensations are not the problem. It's the confusion of who we are. That's the issue.
And the constant practice of returning to that which we are, to experience life from that spaciousness, from that witness. And I know for me, when in that process, of thinking I was my thoughts, thinking I was, my emotions and my body and all this, to really expanding into this larger state of being and wholeness and awareness, that in the beginning, or not even in the beginning, in the process, like the times that I was able to be spacious, and in that spaciousness was really those times when I was in stillness. And it was hard for a while to bring that kind of awareness into activity, into
Absolutely.
the doing, into the unfolding activity of life. And so that's been the challenge. And it's not so much now, but that I think is a huge challenge for people, because we're so full of doing from morning till night. To be able to practice, I think, being as we're in that activity is key in this modern age to being able to be embodied.
I do this meditation exercise called spaciousness, stillness, and silence.
Mm-hmm.
So we do like 5 minutes of each. So we start off with the quality of stillness, and we literally become still with our body. We take a particular seat, let's say in a meditation posture, or we could
Mm-hmm.
be sitting. You could be sitting in a seat, but something that's seated where you can remain seated with as little activity as possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for most of us, we're fidgety little beings, right?
Yeah.
And the point of becoming still in the body is because it allows for things to settle down. And we use a mantra called I take refuge in stillness. Right? I
Mm-hmm.
take refuge in stillness. And then we stay still. We don't move our body. There'll be temptations to move our body. We can relax with that. And we settle out, we settle out, we settle out. And what happens is thoughts, emotions, and sensations become softer as the body becomes more still.
Mm-hmm.
And that stillness is not only on the gross level of the body, like the musculature, let's say, and the bones and the ligaments. It's a stillness that goes way deep into the energetic agitation. This is important. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
stillness all the way to the core. Like if I'm stirring a spoon and or whatever, something in water, and
Mm-hmm.
you're seeing the waves, let's say at a distance, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way to settle out those waves is to stop stirring in the center, right? So our agitation on the more gross surface level is not coming because our muscles and bones and ligaments and all the fascia is agitated. It's the more subtle energy that's agitated that's giving rise to that contraction. So we go to the stillness and we still that. Then we shift to I take refuge in silence, right? Silence. The silence here is one, formally not speaking during this time, not to say
Mm-hmm.
anything, like literally not to speak. The second one is the quieting down of believing and picking up the chatter. So we say, I take refuge in silence. And again, the silence is much deeper than the expression of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's a subtle kind of silence that is there before the arising of thinking. It's subtle.
Mm-hmm.
Do that for a few minutes. Then we move into spaciousness. I take refuge as spaciousness. So now we experience our sense of embodied being as infinite, as spacious, meaning that experience is happening through us, not to us. Once again, through us, not to us. And so we do that for a few minutes. And just in that 15 minutes alone, then what you were talking about before, the activity, imagine
Mm-hmm.
then getting up and we have taken that, deeply within the body. That's going to then have a momentum in our doing. And then, of course, we'll become contracted again in the doing, you know,
That is the game, isn't it?
that is the game. And then
Yeah.
we do a little bit more mindful formal practice. The practice that you were talking about with the feet and the being mindful,
Mm-hmm.
that's a classic Thich Nhat Hanh,
Oh, okay.
piece in every step, we call it.
Mm-hmm.
Classic Buddhist meditation of mindful walking. It's great.
Okay. So in the process for me, from being that person that believed I was in the doing, and the thinker and the feeler and the doer, and that process and that time now where I'm definitely much more in the beingness that is in the activity of life. In that transition, there was a period of time, and this was kind of this, we talked about addictions at another point, I believe. There was a mental addiction to the probably biochemistry, but to the attachment as the doer. Because when I was in beingness, and I was the beingness and the was in the activity, like there was a part of me that was rising that was like, well, this is boring. This is unsatisfying. That was really enjoyed the process of being the doer. And then gradually that released as like being the doer kind of lost its excitement, and being in beingness was much more profoundly soothing and helpful. But for a while there, it was a real dissatisfaction and frustration, and like, oh my God, this is so boring. I don't want to do this. This isn't it. So is it just a process of working through that, or what do you tell people when they're in that kind of state?
Yeah,
Or
everybody does that. It's a classically well documented and known phase for meditators. I'll give you the Eastern version and the Western version of this.
Okay.
So
all right.
in the Western version, there's the Jungian and transpersonal world would say then the ego, the name for the conditional activity, right, is driving the whole show, driving the horse cart, right? And directing the horse cart into activity that will be very let's talk about this, vibrant and potent, right? So it gives the illusion of excitement and aliveness. So the ego is driven as a junkie towards wanting to feel high all the time. You understand?
Yeah.
So boredom is right there. It's one of the first things that people experience in sitting down to meditate is being like, well, I'm bored now. Well, from the Western perspective is now the ego that can't entertain itself with every possible way we entertain. So what happens is the resistance, again, Western, the resistance there is in giving way to the ground of being, to be in charge now, to drive life, which means like the king has been dethroned, So boredom is just another manifestation, belief system that we can't experience the fullness of life without the activities of the ego. Boredom is a classic stage, right? And from an Eastern perspective, they don't divide things up into the psychodynamic transpersonal way. For them, it's simply boredom is just another manifestation of energy. Boom, period. They don't care that it's boredom, anxiety, lust, and so forth. Because when the Buddha Siddhartha sat down for 40 days and 40 nights, he experienced the whole lot, from every range of what we call skandhas, from lust to passion to hatred to greed, jealousy, pride, the 5 poisons as we call them. He experienced all of them, and boredom. So, he didn't budge. He knew that they all were manifestations of the same illusion of separation from being. So therefore, after a while, it's not really interesting if it's boredom or agitation or lust or hatred. It's irrelevant, because stripped of the name, it's simply an energy that's moving us towards an object with the grasping and the hope of relief. That's it. So that's from the Eastern perspective, you see. So for both of them, the process is, kind of it's a little bit differently, but now with transpersonal psychology, understanding the bigger picture and feeding off of the methodology of the East, transpersonal psychology is really carrying, and Jungian psychology is carrying the banner of the East in this way. So what do you do in therapy? You again teach the person to settle out, and then stay very open and loving and kind to all the experiences that want to pull you off the damn cushion.
And that is the journey. I mean, this, we talk about the journey to wholeness as kind of our whole conversational path, but
Correct.
this is the journey to wholeness, is moving from those states of separation and attaching to those states of separation and finding excitement in them, because, honestly, there's a lot of drama there. They're very exciting. They rev up the nervous system. They cause all kinds of fun and interesting things to happen. You just look at the news. But once you come into that state of wholeness, where you're in that state of beingness, and you are whole, and everything is happening within that wholeness, that is, oh gosh, it's so much better. And to put a label on it, it's worth the process. I will say that, like, it's worth the constant practice of moving in that direction, because as much as in that early state where attaching to the doer and all the drama of doing felt very vibrant and alive, this place of being where all doing is happening within the being, there's just this quiet, open awareness of everything, and that everything is really doing itself in its own way. And it's fascinating, because you don't have to get attached to any part of the doing. It's like that Tai Chi movement. It's an energy arising and falling within itself that moves you through life.
So you think to yourself, and you try and you say, well, what's the way to change thinking? Well, the way to change thinking is to not do anything. It's simply allow experience. This is a classic Buddhist notion, is that experience unfolds or unties itself. Look at this beautiful way of understanding it. It unties itself, meaning left alone, experience will reveal itself to be nothing more than an epiphenomena of a movement of energy shrouded in a particular thought, emotion, or sensation. It disguised, it's consciousness disguised as these patterns, you see. And well, how do you recognize that it's consciousness itself, being itself? You allow it to reveal itself without any effort. And this is what's called the effortless path. If you hold something in your hand and you want to release it, you don't have to do any effort. You just have to flip your hand upside down. There's no effort in letting something go, because it reveals itself. And this is so important to understand. It's for we have to let go. We've got to let go of the activity, being from a space of intensity and density and motivation for our freedom. We've got to relax that. Now, I know it's a podcast, so if it wasn't for the podcast, I would just say to you, you and I could remain in that space of just being together.
Right, but it is a podcast.
So I invite all of your listeners in that moment between you and I to actually pause that moment for 5 to 10 seconds and let everything we've done so far move into being, and just silence for a bit.
All right, so this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I hope that people have some tools now to be able to kind of expand into embodiment a little bit more, and to play with this idea that you are the witness observer that is observing all that is happening and all that is doing.
And we're not actually the observer, we're the knowing quality. The observer comes out of it's there's 3 steps that have to happen, but the observer is a very important step, but then we have to also resolve the observer as a someone or a something, instead of simply the quality of knowing. And that's a whole different topic.
All right. Can you, well, actually I do want you to, because you're right. And because I did the observer thing again. I'm such a statistic, apparently. I'm a Buddhist statistic. But I did the observer without any formal training. Like, all of this was just me figuring this out on my own. I didn't have any formal training like you did. So apparently there's a path that we all tend to follow, and I'm a statistic on that path.
Yes.
But that was the thing. Like, it was a lot of work. And I don't want to say effort, but it was a lot of attentiveness to move from being like the identifying with the doing, to being the observer of that, the observer of thought, the observer of emotion. And then there was this place. I'm like, well, wait a minute. If there's an observer, then there's still a separation. There's still an object and a subject.
That's right.
And
That's
then I was like, oh, so if I'm not the object of the subject, then I'm the thing behind it. And I just never had a word for it. Like I call it unity consciousness. But so thank you.
Knowing.
You call it knowing. Okay, so the knowing, and that is that third state. I hadn't divided them up quite so succinctly, but that knowing that the observer is contained within, but the observer is the path to that knowing. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that is very, very true.
It's very subtle, but a lot of people in the mindful, movement teach it and practice it, that we are developing a witness observer, which actually creates a lot of confusion and a lot of tension for people. Yeah. And then they become neurotic, that they're walking around life being like, okay, I'm a witness observer, now what? And it's like much more tighter. And then there's one more step of seeing that, wait, in order for there to be a witness observer, there first has to be the field, the open dimensional field of knowing being, that simply is not an identity, that's not bound in time and space, that is sort of the field of activity, as we call it.
And it's not bound. So tell me what your thoughts are on this. That, in my view, it's not bound by the physical body. It's not something that is part of our physical body. It's a quality that transcends everything, and that we experience even as we're in a physical body, but is not tied to our physical experience.
And that's the quality of embodiment. The quality of embodiment means that, yes, we are localized knowing being, yet we are infinitely free. So it's actually both. Okay. Otherwise, why be incarnated? Do you know what I mean? What's the point of then arising?
What would be the point? Yes.
Exactly. So in this realm, I mean, are there other realms that are not embodied realms in terms of a physical body? I'm probably going to say yes. I think that that in creation in the 2 billion galaxies now.
Oh yeah, it's ridiculously high, and trillions and trillions of planets.
Planets. I mean, beyond numbers that we can even imagine of what we've seen. There has to be expressions in the universe that are not bound to bodies. Yeah. So, but since we are here with this expression, then we need to learn to be localized and free at the same time.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's always wonderful talking with you. And you can find Alex's information on conversationsfromtheedge.net website, or in the show notes, wherever you're listening to this. And there's a meditation that will be there for you as well, so that you can practice embodiment and Alex style. So go ahead and grab that and enjoy. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to have our next conversation. And it was wonderful talking with you again.
You too. Thank you.
This is your host, Christine Madera. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation from the edge of consciousness. You can find all our conversations at conversationsfromtheedge.net. You'll also find links to schedule a private conversation with me or any of my friends, as well as tools to help you expand your own consciousness and explore what's possible for you outside the boundaries of your current perceptions. Feel free to use this podcast to start your own conversation by sharing it with friends, on social media, in your blog, or even in your own podcast. And as always, live the adventure of pushing your own edge. It's the most amazing adventure there is.